He slapped me in front of everyone, but he had no idea the dinner I served that night would change the whole house, and shake every soul at that table. Baby, let me tell you something right now. There comes a moment in every woman's life when she realizes she isn't God's doormat, she is God's daughter. And daughters of the Most High don't stay silent when pain tries to take their voice. I didn't wake up planning to fight for my dignity that day, but life has a strange way of pushing you to the edge just so you finally learn how to stand. And when I stood, oh honey, they felt it. They weren't ready for the kind of dinner I was about to serve, because that evening I walked into that kitchen not as a victim, not as a weak little wife, but as a woman whose spirit had finally woken up. The slap did not just land on my face that day, it landed on every silent part of me that I had hidden away for years. When his hand came down, I felt the shock spread through my skin, but the real pain came from the way the room reacted, or rather the way it did not react at all. I stood there with the sting burning through my cheek, and for a moment it felt like the whole world tilted. Not because of the force, but because of the truth it exposed. The truth that I had been pretending not to see for so long. The truth that I had allowed myself to be broken down piece by piece until there was barely anything left of who I once was. I remember the way the air felt heavy around me, the kind of heavy that makes it hard to breathe, like the atmosphere itself is trying to push you to your knees. My eyes were open, but it felt like everything around me had gone blurry. I could hear voices, but they were faint, like they were coming from the end of a long hallway. I felt alone in that room filled with people, and that kind of loneliness is worse than any physical blow because it tells you that you are not just hurt, you are unseen. You were unprotected. You were unvalued. I had spent so much time convincing myself that things were not as bad as they felt, that the disrespect was a misunderstanding, that the anger was just stress, that the insults were temporary, and that the silence after every fight meant peace and not punishment. But that slap stripped every excuse away. It ripped the blindfold off my spirit. Suddenly I could see with painful clarity the reality I had been avoiding. It was the kind of clarity that hurts like fresh daylight on eyes that have been kept in the dark too long. As I stood there, the heat on my face pulsing like slow fire, I kept asking myself one question. How did I get here? How did I allow myself to stay in a place where my worth could be struck so easily? How did I shrink so small that someone felt bold enough to raise a hand against me without fear of consequence? And worse, how did I let myself believe that this was what marriage meant? That this was normal, that this was love? I had always promised myself that I would never tolerate that kind of disrespect, yet here I was standing in the aftermath of it as if I had been expecting it. I felt my heart pounding in my chest, not just from the shock but from the wave of humiliation that followed. Humiliation is a cold thing. It crawls over your skin like ice. It makes you feel exposed and naked even when you are fully clothed. It makes you want to hide your face even from your own reflection. And in that moment it felt like every eye in the room was looking at me, not with concern, not with empathy, but with a quiet acceptance, like they had been waiting for this moment, like it was just another day in the life of a woman who should keep her head down and stay quiet. But I did not cry. Not because I was strong, but because the tears were frozen inside me. They did not even know where to go. My body was too stunned to react. My soul was too wounded to release anything. I felt like I had left my own body and was watching myself from across the room. A woman I barely recognized. A woman who had dimmed her own fire to keep peace. A woman who had lost her spark somewhere in the routines and sacrifices that never seemed to be enough. In that strange out-of-body moment I looked at myself not with pity but with a deep sorrow. I realized I had abandoned myself long before he ever laid a hand on me. I had walked away from my own needs, my own dreams, my own voice. I had become so focused on holding the relationship together that I had let my own identity fall apart. And that slap forced me to face the truth that the version of me standing there was a shadow of the woman I used to be. The room stayed quiet, almost too quiet, like the walls themselves were holding their breath. I could feel the shock from others, but it was distant. No one rushed toward me. No one stood between us. It was like everyone wanted to stay neutral in a moment where neutrality was just another form of betrayal. And that silence cut deeper than the slap ever could. Pain on the skin fades. But the memory of people watching you break and doing nothing stays with you long after the bruise is gone. I kept standing though, my body stiff, my mind spinning, my soul trembling. Yet something inside me began to shift. A slow steady shift, like a chain snapping link by link. It was not anger, not yet. It was something quieter but stronger. It was awareness. The awareness that I could not pretend anymore. That I could not keep lying to myself about what this relationship was doing to me. That I could not continue living in a place where I was treated with disdain instead of love. And then something unexpected happened. I felt a wave of clarity wash through me. Not loud, not dramatic, quiet, calm, the kind of clarity that comes when you have reached the breaking point but instead of shattering you stabilize. It was realization. It was awakening. It was the beginning of a new voice inside me. One that had been waiting in silence for far too long. I realized that the slap was not the end of me. It was the beginning of my awareness of me. It was the moment my spirit said enough. It was the moment the version of me who accepted less started to fade and the version of me who demanded more began to rise. Not in anger but in truth. In dignity. In the knowledge that I deserved better than to be treated like a burden or a punching bag or a background character in my own life. I took a slow breath trying to steady the shaking inside me. I could feel my heartbeat beginning to slow. I could feel my mind returning to the room. And when I finally lifted my eyes and looked around I saw everything differently. I saw him differently, the man who claimed to love me yet treated me with disregard. The man who expected loyalty yet offered me none. The man who believed that because he could provide for me he could also control me. That slap revealed the truth about him but a deeper truth about me. I realized that he did not break me with that slap. He revealed that I had already been breaking myself by staying. By accepting behavior that chipped away at my worth. By silencing my voice out of fear of conflict. By trying to win love from someone who did not know how to give it. And once I saw that truth I could not unsee it. I knew in that moment that something had changed forever. I might still be standing in the same room but I was not the same woman. Something inside me had woken up. Something fierce, something sacred, something that had been waiting for me to reclaim it. And though no one else knew it yet I knew that slap would be the last time anyone ever put their hands on me. Because it did not just hit my skin, it hit the part of my soul that still believed in my worth. And once that part woke up there was no going back. They thought I would crumble that day. They thought I would fall apart right there on the spot with tears rolling down my face and my voice shaking as I tried to explain something that was never mine to justify. They expected the kind of breakdown that makes people feel sorry for you and uncomfortable at the same time. The kind that lets them pat you on the shoulder, whisper a few empty words, then return to their own peaceful lives while you stand there holding the pieces of your broken dignity. But I did not break. Not even a little. Something inside me held still and strong. A quiet strength. An energy that did not shake or tremble. It surprised even me. I could feel every eye in that room on me. Watching, waiting, measuring my reaction like my pain was some kind of show. Every breath I took felt like I was pulling air through thick mud. My cheek was burning from the slap but the deeper pain was the humiliation, the sharp sting of knowing that the people around me expected weakness from me as if that was all I was capable of. They were ready to witness a scene. They were ready to whisper afterward about how emotional I was, how sensitive, how dramatic. They were ready to reassure the man who hurt me that I would calm down and behave eventually because that is what women like me supposedly do. But I refused to give them that performance. I stood still. I held my posture. I kept my eyes steady. My mouth stayed closed not because I had nothing to say but because silence in that moment carried more power than 1,000 words. I have learned that sometimes speaking too quickly gives your strength away but silence can build a fortress around your spirit. And that day I needed that fortress more than I needed anything else. The room became so quiet that I could hear my own heartbeat. It was racing inside my chest but no one else could hear that part. All they could see was a woman who refused to collapse. A woman who even after being slapped in front of everyone still stood tall. A woman who did not beg or panic or lash out. And that silence made them uncomfortable. Deeply uncomfortable. They expected chaos. They got composure. They expected weakness. They got calm. They expected me to shrink. I did not move an inch. I could feel the confusion spreading around the room. People shifted in their chairs. They looked at one another. Some looked at him trying to gauge his reaction. Some looked at me with a strange discomfort, like they were seeing a version of me they did not recognize. And in a way they were. I did not recognize myself either. I had spent so long trying to avoid conflict, trying to keep peace, trying to hold things together, that I had forgotten that I possessed a quiet strength. A strength that did not need to scream or hit or argue. A strength that could stand in complete silence and still make an entire room feel uneasy. He expected me to respond with fear or anger or tears. He expected me to defend myself or plead with him or storm out in a burst of emotion. But I gave him nothing. Not a word, not a flinch, not a tear, and that nothing was everything. Because a silent woman is not always a broken one. Sometimes a silent woman is simply deciding how much of herself she is no longer willing to give away. As I stood there, I noticed how even the smallest movements in the room seemed exaggerated. Someone clicked a glass on the table and then stopped abruptly. Someone cleared their throat too softly, like they were afraid to interrupt the tension that was hanging in the air. Someone else looked at the floor, unable to meet my eyes, because the shame they should have felt for him was now turning into shame for themselves. They did nothing. They watched. And that made them part of the cruelty. But their discomfort did not concern me in that moment. What mattered was the fire starting to burn quietly inside me. Not rage, not bitterness, something deeper, something sharper, a realization that I had allowed myself to be underestimated for too long. People had grown used to me being quiet, to me swallowing pain, to me being the one who softened every moment even when I was the one hurting. They had mistaken my patience for weakness, my loyalty for silence, my love for submission, and in that moment I let them see what they had overlooked all those years. A stillness that came from strength, not fear. And as I breathed through the pain, I felt a steady calmness rise in my chest. It was strange, a peace in the middle of humiliation, a calm in the center of chaos. It was as if my soul stepped forward and whispered to me that I would not be in this place much longer. That something had shifted permanently, that the version of me who tolerated disrespect had died the second his hand touched my face. It was a painful awakening, but an awakening nonetheless. People expect women to break when they are hurt publicly. They expect tears. They expect apologies. They expect helplessness. But nothing confuses an abuser more than a woman who refuses to react the way he expects her to. He kept looking at me, waiting for me to crumble. Waiting for me to shout. Waiting for me to fall into the old pattern where he hurts me and I try to fix what he broke. But I just looked back at him with a steady gaze. And for the first time in a long time he was the one who looked unsettled. My stillness was not obedience. My silence was not acceptance. My calm was not forgiveness. It was the beginning of something else. It was the start of a shift too deep for anyone in that room to understand yet. And that shift made him nervous. He tried to justify himself. He said something sharp under his breath. But I did not respond. I did not return the energy he was reaching for. I did not feed the confrontation he wanted. Because my silence was not about him. It was about me. When a woman reaches a point where she no longer reacts the same way every time she is hurt, it signals that something inside her is changing. Something is growing. Something is breaking free. And once that seed of awareness begins to grow, it cannot be stopped. Not by slaps. Not by shame. Not by the opinions of others. Not by fear of the unknown. I could see in their eyes that they did not know what to do with this new quiet version of me. The version who was standing but not shaking. The version who was breathing but not panicking. The version who was hurting but not falling apart. They could not decide whether to comfort me or avoid me or pretend nothing happened. And that uncertainty cracked the foundation of the entire room. A woman who stays calm in the moment she is expected to break becomes a mirror for everyone around her. A mirror that shows them their own cowardice, their own silence, their own inability to stand for what is right. And no one likes what they see in that mirror. So they looked away, but I continued to stand. In that stillness I found a strength I never knew I had. A strength that did not rely on noise or reaction. A strength that simply existed. A strength that reminded me that dignity does not disappear just because someone tries to strip it away. Dignity can rise from the quietest places inside you. It can stand tall even when everything else is falling. It can grow in silence like a seed pushing through solid ground. They thought I would break. But I did not. And that single unexpected truth changed the balance in the entire room. It marked the moment I stopped playing the role they wrote for me. It marked the moment I stepped out of the shadow they had kept me in. It marked the moment I realized that my strength did not need permission to exist. It simply needed me to stop hiding it. And once that strength rose, there was no putting it back. They thought I would collapse the moment his hand struck my face. They thought I would dissolve into tears and trembling and apologies that were never mine to give. They waited for the familiar script where a woman swallows her pain and bends her head to keep the peace that was never real to begin with. They expected a scene they could whisper about for days. They expected me to be fragile, broken and overwhelmed. But I did not fold. I did not sink. I did not give them even a tiny piece of the performance they came to witness. Instead I stood still, so still that the silence around me grew heavy like a thick blanket pulling the air from the room. The sting on my cheek pulsed with heat, but my spirit refused to react the way they assumed it would. Every eye in that room turned to me, waiting for a meltdown that never arrived. They wanted to see my weakness because witnessing someone else break makes people feel stronger than they actually are. It lets them pretend they would have handled it better. But when I did not break, it unsettled them in a way they were not prepared to face. My breath felt sharp in my chest, like each inhale was scraping against something raw inside me. I could hear the faint hum of the fan. I could hear the shifting of feet, the nervous coughs, the quick glances bouncing from me to him and back to me again. But all the noises around me melted into the background. What mattered in that moment was the quiet rising inside me. A quiet that did not come from fear or shock, but from a strength that had been sleeping for too long. I kept my chin lifted. I kept my back straight. I kept my eyes open even though everything inside me ached. And that posture confused them. They were more rattled by my stillness than they would have been by screaming or sobbing or running from the room. People are always more frightened by a woman who refuses to fall apart. They know how to handle tears. They know how to manage emotional outbursts. They do not know what to do when the woman stands tall in her pain, like the pain is a crown and not a chain. I could feel him watching me too. The same man who moments earlier had lifted his hand in anger now looked at me with something new in his eyes. Not guilt, not remorse, but confusion, uncertainty, a flicker of doubt. He expected dominance. He expected me to shrink back into submission. But when I stayed silent and strong, I could see something shift in him. He was not in control anymore. Not of the moment. Not of me. Not of the energy in the room. My silence robbed him of the reaction he wanted. My calmness forced him to face himself for the first time in a long time. The others looked trapped between their desire to comfort me and their fear of angering him. Their faces held a strange mixture of surprise and discomfort. They thought they knew me. They thought they understood my personality, my tolerance, my limits. But the person standing there no longer fit their expectations. I was no longer the quiet peacekeeper bending over backwards to soothe every conflict. I was no longer the soft-spoken woman who carried the weight of everyone else while ignoring her own pain. I was a new version of myself. One forged in fire. One awakened by humiliation. One strengthened by silence. The tension in the room thickened as the seconds stretched. No one dared to speak first. No one dared to touch me. No one dared to acknowledge what had just happened. It was as if admitting the truth out loud would make them responsible for it. So they tried to pretend. They tried to look away. They tried to treat the moment like it would fade if they ignored it long enough. But I stood there unmoving. And my stillness forced them to sit with the truth they wanted to escape. Inside my mind I replayed the moment over and over again. The sound of the slap. The sharp sting on my skin. The look on his face afterward. The way the others watched. The silence that filled the room. And with every replay the fire inside me grew steadier. Not hotter. Not wilder. Steadier. Controlled. Focused. That fire gave me strength. That fire reminded me of who I used to be. A woman who once knew her worth. A woman who once refused to accept disrespect. A woman who had slowly been buried under years of emotional exhaustion. I realized that they expected me to break because they had grown used to a smaller version of me. A version that tried to avoid conflict even at the cost of my own happiness. A version that apologized even when I was the one hurting. A version that carried burdens that were not mine just to keep the family functioning. They assumed I would crumble because that was the pattern. They had mistaken my patience for weakness. They had mistaken my kindness for submission. They had mistaken my silence for acceptance. But true silence does not always mean defeat. Sometimes silence is the calm before transformation. Sometimes silence is the moment when a woman gathers herself. Sometimes silence is the first step toward reclaiming power that once belonged to her. And that day my silence began rewriting everything. I could feel my heartbeat slowing. I could feel the shaking inside me settle. I could feel my mind clearing like fog lifting at sunrise. And as my clarity returned, I realized something that changed the entire direction of the moment. I did not owe anyone a reaction. I did not owe anyone an explanation. I did not owe anyone a display of emotion to make them feel better about watching me suffer. I owed myself dignity, peace, strength, and that was exactly what I was choosing. When I finally looked directly at him, he blinked. Just once. But that single blink told me everything. He understood that something shifted. He understood that the woman he hit was not the same woman staring back at him now. He understood that his power over me had cracked. Maybe not visibly, maybe not in a way others could see yet. But he felt it, and I felt it too. The silence stretched longer. It grew heavier. It wrapped around him. It wrapped around the others. It wrapped around the entire room like a judgment they all felt but no one dared to acknowledge. And I stayed quiet through all of it. Not because I was scared. Not because I was frozen. But because I was finally seeing clearly. My stillness was strength. My calm was control. My silence was protection. One person shifted uncomfortably in their seat. Another looked at the floor. Someone else tried to pretend they were interested in something across the room. But every movement, every breath, every heartbeat was tied to the tension created by my refusal to break. People talk a lot about bravery like it is loud and fiery and fierce. But sometimes bravery is quiet. Sometimes bravery is the act of staying still when your entire world is shaking. Sometimes bravery is refusing to give someone the satisfaction of seeing you crumble. Sometimes bravery is choosing silence because silence forces others to confront what they have done. And that day my silence was the bravest thing I had done in years. I did not yell. I did not plead. I did not run. I did not hide my face. I simply stood there, and in doing so I reminded myself of something I had forgotten. I was built from strength. I carried resilience in my bones. I had survived things that should have broken me long before this moment. I had endured storms and disappointments and betrayals and heartbreaks. This moment, painful as it was, would not destroy me. It would restore me. It would awaken me. It would become the beginning of a shift so powerful that everyone in that room would feel its weight. They thought I would break. But what they saw instead was a woman rising in silence. A woman reclaiming herself. A woman whose strength did not need noise. A woman who would never again allow anyone to mistake her quiet for weakness. And once that version of me emerged, there was no going back. When I walked into the kitchen after everything that happened, my hands were shaking but my mind was awakening in a way I had never felt before. The air in that room felt different, almost heavier, almost alive. It was like the walls themselves knew something in me had shifted. My heart was beating fast and slow at the same time, fast with pain, slow with dawning truth. I kept trying to steady myself with deep breaths, but each breath felt sharper than the last, as if even the air wanted me to face what I had been avoiding for years. The kitchen had always been my place of comfort, my place of warmth, my place of routine. Yet on that day it felt like a classroom where life itself was the teacher, and the lesson waiting for me was not easy. I reached for the pot and my fingers trembled. I rinsed the rice and felt the cold water run through my hands like a reminder that I was still alive, still here, still capable of choosing something different. My soul felt bruised, but it was also waking up with a slow rising power that surprised me. As I chopped vegetables, I kept repeating the same question over and over again inside my head like a broken melody. Why do I keep feeding people who starve me emotionally? Why do I keep giving kindness to those who give me pain? Why do I give loyalty to those who treat it like dust on their shoes? Each slice of the knife felt like it was cutting through illusions, not vegetables. Each movement felt like it was carving open a truth I had refused to see. I had spent years trying to be the glue that held everything together. I had been the one who soothed tension, the one who apologized first, the one who tried to make the house feel peaceful even when my own heart was in pieces. I cooked meals with love even when I received disdain. I prayed for harmony even when the walls were echoing with disrespect. I became so good at pretending everything was fine that even I forgot what real peace felt like. I convinced myself that patience was virtue, but I never admitted that my patience had slowly become self-abandonment. As I stirred the pot, I felt something rise inside me. Not anger, not rage, something much more powerful. Awareness. Real awareness. The kind that comes when you stop running from your own truth. The kind that shows you every place you gave too much. The kind that makes you see every moment you stayed silent when you should have spoken. The kind that reveals how deeply you allowed pain to settle in your life because you were afraid of losing love. But love that requires you to lose yourself is not love. It is a slow erosion of the soul. The vegetable sizzled in the pan, but the sound felt distant. My mind was traveling backward through time, replaying years of small hurts that I had brushed aside. Every insult, every cold look, every moment he laughed at my feelings. Every time he made me feel foolish. Every time he dismissed my dreams. Every time I accepted less than I deserved because I thought marriage meant sacrificing everything, even myself. Those memories rose like ghosts, surrounding me with truths I had buried under busy days and forced smiles. I remembered nights when I cried quietly in the bathroom so no one would hear. I remembered mornings when I woke with a heavy chest but pushed myself through the day pretending to be strong. I remembered times I tried to talk about my feelings and he turned it into an argument that left me feeling smaller than before. I remembered moments when I needed comfort and instead received coldness. Years of emotional hunger disguised as loyalty. Years of shrinking my spirit just to keep peace. The stirring spoon paused in my hand as a wave of clarity washed over me. I had been feeding everyone but myself. Not just with meals but with patience, with effort, with energy, with understanding. I poured love into a house that rarely poured love back. I nourished people who did not know how to nourish me. And for the first time I asked myself why. Why had I forgotten who I was? Why had I allowed my soul to be treated like a doormat? Why had I given power to someone who used it to hurt me? I realized then that pain is not just pain. Pain is also a message. A warning. A signal. A teacher. But you only learn the lesson when you stop running from it. When you sit with your hurt long enough to understand it. When you stop distracting yourself with chores and responsibilities and finally look at the truth without blinking. That slap was not just violence. It was a revelation. It showed me everything I needed to see but refused to face. I lifted the lid off the pot and the steam rose against my skin, warm and soft. It felt almost like a reminder that not all heat is harmful. Some heat cleanses. Some heat transforms. Some heat awakens strength you forgot you had. I leaned against the counter, letting the warmth settle over me, and let myself feel everything at once: the sadness, the betrayal, the shock, the humiliation, the clarity, the awakening, the slow rise of strength coming from deep within. Cooking became a meditation that day. A slow unfolding of truths. As I added spices, I thought about all the times I had tried to add flavor to a life that was growing bitter. As I placed each ingredient, I realized how often I placed myself last. As I wiped my hands on the towel, I felt the symbolic weight of wiping away years of accepting behavior that chipped away at my spirit. A quiet voice inside me began to speak. A voice I had ignored for years. A voice that sounded steady, sure and powerful. It said, "You deserve respect." It said, "You deserve peace." It said, "You deserve to be seen." It said, "You deserve to be valued." It said, "You deserve better than this." And as that voice grew louder, something inside me shifted. A part of me that had been asleep for too long finally opened its eyes. I stood there in the kitchen, surrounded by pots and pans, yet it felt like sacred ground. A place where truth finally caught up to me. A place where my heart whispered what my mind already knew. A place where I finally realized that staying in a place that hurts you is not strength. Staying is fear disguised as loyalty. Staying is self-abandonment wearing the mask of commitment. And I had abandoned myself for too long. I felt tears welling up, but they were not tears of weakness. They were tears of release. Tears that washed away the layers of denial I had wrapped around my heart. Tears that cleansed the hurt that I had carried alone for years. Tears that marked the end of pretending. Each tear was a truth long ignored. Each tear was a promise to myself. When I wiped my face I did not feel small. I felt lighter, stronger, more awake. The lesson had settled deep into my bones. Pain can crush you if you let it, but it can also rebuild you if you finally listen. Pain can be poison, but it can also be medicine. Pain can destroy or transform. And that day I chose transformation. As the meal cooked I realized I was not just preparing food. I was preparing a decision. A shift. A new chapter. A new version of myself that would no longer bend until she broke. I was rising slowly like steam rising from the pot. Quiet but unstoppable. Soft but powerful. Invisible at first but undeniable. I understood then with full clarity that I could not go back to who I was before that moment. The woman who accepted pain as part of love no longer existed. The woman who silenced her own needs had vanished. The woman who lived to make everyone else comfortable at the cost of her own soul had taken her final breath. The new woman was rising. Aware, awake, unafraid. And once awareness begins there is no turning it off. Once truth speaks you cannot pretend you did not hear it. Once your soul wakes up you cannot lull it back to sleep. By the time the meal was done I knew something else was done too. My tolerance, my excuses, my denial, my fear, all cooked away with the steam that left that kitchen. I walked out carrying the food in my hands but carrying something far more powerful in my heart. I was no longer waiting for someone to treat me better. I was ready to treat myself better. That was the lesson pain had been trying to teach me all along. And finally I listened. When the next morning arrived I felt a strange stillness in my spirit that I had not felt in a long time. It was the kind of stillness that settles deep inside your bones when you have finally reached the moment where you are done being afraid. I stood in my tiny kitchen with the sun touching the counter and I thought about everything that happened the night before. The slap, the humiliation, the way their laughter bounced around me like I was nothing but a joke in my own home. For a moment I felt the old pain rise again, but this time it did not drown me. Instead it fueled something stronger, something sharper, something that whispered, you cannot let this pass. I stared at the pot on the stove and my hands began to move in a rhythm that felt both familiar and new. As I reached for the ingredients my mind replayed every moment when I had shrunk myself to keep peace. Every time I stayed quiet to avoid an argument. Every time I swallowed my pain to protect a man who never protected me. And in that moment I realized something powerful. I had been feeding everyone in that house except myself. I had been serving loyalty while receiving disrespect. I had been giving warmth to people who handed me nothing but coldness. So I told myself that today would be different. Today my dinner would not be a symbol of service. It would be a symbol of my awakening. The house slowly filled with the scent of the food that I cooked with steady hands. Yet my heart held a different kind of heat. A heat born from clarity. I thought about how they walked around the day before feeling bold enough to treat me like an object. And I asked myself why I had tolerated it. Why I had let their voices define my worth. Why I had allowed their cruelty to settle in my chest as if it belonged there. But as the pot simmered I felt something inside me rise. A quiet voice that said enough. A voice that felt small before but now sounded like thunder even though no one else could hear it. I prepared the table slowly and purposefully. Not because I wanted to impress or please anyone. Not because I hoped they would notice my effort. I did it because it was the last time I would ever do it from a place of fear. The plates were set and the aroma of the food drifted through the rooms and I knew they would come just like always, expecting me to serve them without question. And that expectation sparked a kind of courage inside me that made my back straighten and my breath deepen. As I stirred the final dish I thought about the night of humiliation. How my husband had looked at me with eyes filled with something ugly. How he raised his hand like my feelings meant nothing. How the guests had enjoyed the scene like it was entertainment. I let those memories pass through me, not to hurt me but to remind me why I had decided that today would be different. I was not going to argue or shout or beg. I was not going to cry or demand an apology. No, I had learned that the most powerful shift happens in silence, when you act with purpose instead of reacting with pain. I heard footsteps behind me and voices growing closer, but I stayed focused. The pot, the spoon, the slow rhythmic movement of the food. It was grounding me, reminding me that this moment belonged to me. They entered the room expecting the same version of me that they had broken the night before. The quiet woman who cleaned up after their cruelty, who accepted disrespect as if it were part of marriage. But when they saw my face they paused. Perhaps they sensed the change. Perhaps they felt the air tighten. I did not raise my voice. I did not smile. I simply looked at them with a calm they did not expect. My dinner was ready, but something inside me told me not to serve it in the usual way. I placed each dish on the table with grace, yet my movements held a message. A message that said, I am not yours to bruise. I am not yours to belittle. I am not yours to break. They sat down quietly, waiting for my next move. I did not hurry. I did not bow. Instead I took a seat for myself first, something they were not used to. And that small act shook them more than any shouting could have. The room held a heavy silence as I began to speak slowly, firmly, and without fear. I told them that I had cooked this dinner with intention. I told them that while I prepared every dish I thought about the woman I had been and the woman I was becoming. I spoke about pain not as a wound but as a teacher. I told them that last night was the final night they would ever see me stay silent in the face of disrespect. My voice was steady and they listened, not out of love but out of shock. They were not used to seeing my strength. They had never seen me stand in my own power. I explained that dinner tonight was not just food. It was a statement, a turning point, a reminder that I had a choice and that I would no longer choose suffering. They stared at me wide-eyed, unsure of what to say. My husband shifted in his seat, perhaps expecting me to soften or retract my words. But I did not. I kept speaking with the same calm that coated every syllable. I told him that a marriage without respect would not continue. That I would not live with a man who used his hands for harm. That I would not host people who treated me like entertainment. And that if anyone in that room ever expected me to stay small again, they would be deeply disappointed. As the silence deepened, I lifted my own fork and took the first bite. It was a simple act, yet it echoed in the room like a declaration. Their eyes widened. They were used to me waiting until everyone else was served. They were used to me eating last, or sometimes not eating at all until the chaos settled. But not today. Today I fed myself first. Today I honored myself first. Today my dinner became a symbol of the shift they never saw coming. One by one they began to taste the food, and the shock on their faces told me that they felt something different. Not because the flavor changed, but because the woman behind the flavor had changed. They could sense the strength simmering beneath the surface. They could taste the courage woven into every bite. They could feel the message in their bones. This was no longer the dinner of a woman who served out of fear. This was the dinner of a woman who had awakened. And their reaction did not scare me. It empowered me. I realized that sometimes you do not need to fight. Sometimes you do not need to scream. Sometimes you just need to rise in quiet strength and let your actions speak. My dinner did exactly that. It drove them into a silence deeper than guilt. A silence filled with realization. A silence that told me they finally understood. I was no longer the woman they could harm without consequence. I was no longer their doormat. I was a woman who had found her voice. And once a woman finds her voice, she can never go back. When the table grew quiet and every pair of eyes followed my every movement, I felt a strange and steady strength growing inside me. Not loud or fierce, but calm, almost gentle yet undeniable. It was the kind of strength that rises only after a person has been pushed so far that they discover the hidden walls inside themselves, walls they never knew they had. And as I sat there at that table surrounded by people who had watched my humiliation like it was entertainment, I felt those walls solidify around me. They were not built out of bitterness. They were built out of clarity. My husband kept staring at me like he was seeing someone he had never met before. His mouth moved slightly as if he wanted to speak, but his voice could not find its way out. For years he had spoken over me, spoken through me, spoken around me as if I were nothing but air. But now he sat there trying to form words while my silence held more power than anything he had ever said. He lifted his hand slightly as if to reach for his water butt. Even that movement looked unsure. For the first time he seemed aware of how heavy his presence had been in my life and how light it had suddenly become now that I was no longer shrinking for him. I looked at him and I saw not a husband but a man who had taken my kindness for weakness and my patience for permission. A man who believed he could break me and still keep me. And it was in that moment that I realized something so simple yet so powerful. I did not owe him my suffering. I did not owe him my silence. I did not owe him my loyalty when he had shattered every ounce of his. As I spoke again, my voice was slow, steady and deliberate, each word rolling out of me like truth flowing from a deep well. I told him that I remembered every moment he had chosen cruelty over love. Every moment he had raised his voice instead of offering understanding. Every moment he had mocked my feelings instead of trying to protect them. I told him that I had carried those moments on my shoulders like stones, believing that maybe if I just loved harder, if I just tried more, if I just stayed quieter, he would finally change. But people do not change when we protect their comfort. They change only when they are forced to face their own reflection. And I was finally holding up the mirror. He blinked slowly, his face tightening as if each word pierced a place he thought I would never touch. His guests sat frozen, their utensils still in their hands, as if they feared even the smallest sound might shatter the moment. And maybe it would have. Because everything in that room felt fragile and new. The air, the silence, the weight of my truth. It all felt like glass, and they knew I was no longer afraid to break what needed breaking. I told him that a home without respect is not a home but a cage. I told him that a marriage without safety is not a marriage but a battlefield. I told him that I was done walking barefoot through emotional glass every day just to keep peace that never truly existed. His jaw tightened, and for a moment anger flickered in his eyes, the old familiar fire. But it did not intimidate me anymore. It rolled off me like smoke, disappearing before it could touch my skin. Because when a woman reaches the point where she stops fearing a man's rage, that man loses the last illusion of control he has ever held. I continued speaking, not to hurt him but to free myself. I told him I wanted a life where my voice mattered, where my presence was valued, where my feelings were not treated like trash on the floor. I told him that if he wanted to keep me, he would have to confront every part of himself he had ignored, every flaw he had justified, every cruelty he had excused. And he knew I meant every word. He leaned back in his chair slowly, almost like a man realizing that the ground beneath him had shifted and he no longer knew how to stand on it. For years he had believed that he could talk to me however he wanted, act however he wanted, treat me however he wanted, because I would always stay. But now he was staring at a woman who had tasted her own strength and discovered it was sweeter than his apologies. The guests started glancing at him, then at me, then back at him, as if they were witnessing something they had never thought possible. One of them tried to speak, but their voice cracked and died in their throat, so they looked back down at their plate. This was not their show anymore. The entertainment they sought had turned into a revelation they were not prepared to handle. I felt a wave of calm move through me as I looked at them. I told them that I was not angry at them for laughing the night before. Not because they deserved forgiveness, but because I refused to carry their shame on my back. I told them that their reaction said more about them than it ever said about me. And suddenly their eyes fell to the table in a way that told me they finally understood that the person they mocked was the person who now stood stronger than all of them. My husband finally found his voice, but it was not sharp or commanding. It was unsteady, like a man walking barefoot over truth. He said my name slowly, almost in disbelief. The sound of it made me realize how little affection he had ever placed in it. He tried to defend himself, but his words fell flat like stones tossed into a well that had no echo. Because excuses cannot stand in the presence of truth. They shrink under it. They dissolve under it. He said he had been stressed. He said it was a mistake. He said he did not mean to hurt me. But I stared at him and I let the silence answer for me. Because sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is refuse to soften the truth. I looked him straight in the eyes and told him that stress does not excuse cruelty. That mistakes do not repeat themselves over and over unless they are choices disguised as accidents. That a man who does not mean to hurt his wife does not raise his hand to her. And he knew it. He knew I was right. His shoulders dropped and his eyes fell because the truth pressed on him like a weight he could no longer push away. I stood up slowly and the legs of my chair scraped against the floor in a way that made every heart in the room skip a beat. My hands were steady, my breath even, my spine straight, like a woman who had finally reclaimed herself. I told him that I would no longer live with a man who treated me like something he owned rather than someone he vowed to love. I told him that from this moment forward I would choose my peace over his pride. My dignity over his ego. My safety over his temper. I walked around the table with quiet steps and I could feel their eyes follow me like shadows. When I reached the doorway I paused and turned back to them. I told them that this dinner might be the last they ever ate in my home because the next chapter of my life would not include people who celebrated my pain. And the silence that followed felt like justice. I left the table and walked toward the bedroom, not to hide but to gather what belonged to me. As I walked I felt something lift off my shoulders like a weight I had carried for years without knowing how heavy it truly was. And in that moment I realized that freedom does not always arrive with shouts or arguments. Sometimes it arrives quietly through a single decision. A decision to stop accepting what hurts you. A decision to stop waiting for someone else to change. A decision to choose yourself. And once you choose yourself everything else becomes clear. When I stepped into the quiet hallway and left that heavy dining room behind me I felt my heartbeat change in a way I had never felt before. It was steady, bold and unshaken, like it finally understood its own rhythm. For so long it had beaten in fear, in confusion, in desperation, but now it beat with purpose. Every step I took felt like a step out of a life that had drained me for years. The walls of my home suddenly looked different too, not like a shelter but like a witness to every tear I had ever cried, every insult I had ever endured, and every moment I had stayed silent when I should have spoken up for myself. But this time I was not walking away in defeat. I was walking away in power. Inside the bedroom I began to gather a few of my things, but I did not rush. I moved slowly but with certainty. I knew I was not just packing clothes. I was packing pieces of my truth, pieces of my future, pieces of myself that I had abandoned along the way. I folded each item as if it carried a message telling me to keep going. And as I did, the air in the room felt lighter, as if even the house understood that I had reached the point where turning back was no longer an option. Behind me through the walls I could hear faint whispers, chairs shifting, uneasy breathing, the shocked murmurs of people who had never imagined I would be capable of choosing myself. They were probably gathering their things, unsure of what to say, unsure of how to justify their behavior, unsure of how to face a woman who had finally refused to remain the version of herself they had used and abused. I heard someone say my husband's name softly, as if they were trying to figure out what he would do next. But what he did or did not do no longer mattered to me. His reactions, his anger, his excuses, none of it belonged to me anymore. I stood in front of the mirror for a long moment and looked at myself. The woman staring back was not the same woman who had endured a slap and humiliation with tears streaming down her face. She was not the woman who had tried to keep peace by sacrificing her own voice. She was not the woman who believed pain was part of love or that suffering made her strong. No, this woman had walked through fire and discovered she could rise from it without burning. She had found her strength not in revenge, not in hatred, but in truth and self-respect. As I looked at my reflection I remembered every moment of my life when I had begged for love, when I had begged for kindness, when I had begged for basic human decency from someone who never bothered to offer it freely. And it hit me deeply. I had been begging for things I should have already owned. My worth, my dignity, my peace. None of these things belonged in the hands of someone else. They were mine, always had been, always would be. I placed my hand on my chest and inhaled slowly, letting the reality sink in. I was choosing myself, and there is no force more powerful than a woman who decides that she will no longer be broken by someone else's cruelty. For the first time in my life my heart did not feel small. It felt full, strong, alive. When I stepped back into the hallway the house felt even quieter. My husband stood at the end of it, his face clouded with confusion, regret and fear. Not fear of losing me though. Fear of losing control. But I did not allow his expression to sway me. I walked toward him with a calm that came from a place deeper than he could ever reach. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but I raised my hand slightly, not to silence him but to show him that I was speaking now and he would listen whether he liked it or not. I told him that I had loved him once with everything inside me. I told him that I had believed in him even when he gave me nothing to believe in. I told him that I had carried our marriage like a burden on my back while he dragged it through the dirt. But I also told him that love that destroys you is not love. That loyalty that demands your suffering is not loyalty. That marriage without respect is not a marriage at all. His eyes softened and for a moment he looked like a child who had lost something precious but still did not know how to care for it. He reached for my hand but I stepped back. Not out of anger but out of finality. I told him that forgiveness was possible but returning was not. That healing could come but reconciliation could not. I had reached a place where I understood that staying would only teach him that his behavior had no consequences. And I refused to teach him that lesson any longer. He whispered my name but his voice could not touch me. I had built a boundary so strong, so firm, so rooted in self-worth that nothing he said could shake it. And that was when I realized something powerful. When a woman truly chooses herself, no apology can chain her, no guilt can bind her, no fear can stop her. She becomes her own rescue. Her own voice. Her own freedom. I walked past him and headed toward the front door. The guests stood in the living room looking uncomfortable and ashamed. Some tried to offer words but their voices sounded empty. They did not deserve my energy. I simply looked at them and nodded a single nod that said, I see you for who you are and I am done pretending I do not. They lowered their eyes because they knew they had failed as human beings. At the door I paused and looked back at the home that had held both my dreams and my nightmares. I realized that although it had been a place of pain, it had also been the place where I found the courage to rise. And so instead of leaving with anger, I left with clarity, with strength, with a sense of power that had been waiting inside me for years. When I stepped outside, the cool air touched my skin like a blessing. The world felt wide open, quiet and welcoming. I stood on the doorstep breathing in the freedom that tasted sweeter than any victory I could have imagined. I felt the beginning of my new life settling into my bones. A life where my voice mattered. A life where my heart was safe. A life where no one could raise a hand to me and expect me to stay. I walked toward the gate slowly, savoring every step. Each step felt like a release. A cleansing. A rebirth. I knew the road ahead would not be easy. Healing takes time. Rebuilding takes patience. But I also knew I was no longer walking alone. I was walking with the version of myself I had always needed. The strong one. The brave one. The honest one. The one who refused to be broken. As I reached the gate I whispered something to myself, something soft yet powerful. I said, you did it. And tears filled my eyes, not from sadness but from pride. Pure, undeniable pride. Because I had survived what was meant to break me. And I had risen into someone stronger than I ever imagined I could be. And as I walked away from that house I knew in my heart that this was not the end of my story. It was the beginning of a life built on self-worth, self-love and self-respect. The beginning of a woman who would never again shrink herself for anyone. The beginning of a future that I would build with my own hands, guided by my own truth. Because once a woman rises from the ashes of her own pain, she never returns to the fire. She becomes the flame.